All right, well, it is 7 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Casey Vance, Executive Director at Ames History Museum, and I want to welcome you all to our online lecture series program. Thanks for being here tonight. We're pleased to be able to offer some of our spring lectures digitally, even though we're not able to all be together. And we're really excited to have Diana Carlin here tonight to talk about the 19th Amendment. I'm going to go ahead and put a poll up on the screen here. And if you would, please just let us know how many people are watching with you today. This will help us get a more accurate count of how many people are here, so thanks for participating in that. This program is being recorded, so if you need to leave early or if you lose connection, no worries. You'll get the recording emailed to you after the program. And if you have questions for Diana during the lecture, I encourage you to use the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring the questions throughout the lecture, and Diana will have some time at the end to answer. We do have one more of these lectures planned. On June 23rd, Doug Biggs will present the Story County Courthouse Fight, 1864 to 1875. And I will go ahead and put a link in the chat box for the registration for that lecture. So if you're interested in that one, go ahead and get registered for that one. And finally, I want to recognize our annual lecture series partner, Ames Public Library. Of course, if we were together in person, these lectures would have been hosted at the library's auditorium. But we're really happy to be able to continue our partnership with the library even in the digital realm. So now I'll pass it over to Kathy Cooney from the Ames Public Library.
Hi everyone, as Casey said, my name is Kathy, and as she also said, normally we'd be presenting to you from the Ames Public Library Auditorium. But welcome to our virtual version of Ames Public Library for this wonderful program presented by Diana. And thanks also to our program partner, the Ames History Museum. So I'd like to remind you all that Ames Public Library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. And we also welcome program proposals through our website. I also want to briefly mention that although the library is physically closed, we're still reaching out to the community in a variety of ways. We have curbside pickup available by appointment, a plethora of digital streaming services, daily content on our Facebook page and YouTube channel, and a weekly radio show at 12 p.m. every Wednesday on KHOI. And now I will pass it off to Kathy Speck, who will introduce tonight's presenter.
We are really fortunate to have such an accomplished person with us tonight. Diana Carlin is a professor emerita of communication and a former associate provost at St. Louis University. Prior to St. Louis University, she was a professor of communication studies and dean of the graduate school and international programs at the University of Kansas. Dr. Carlin's research and teaching center on political communication with an emphasis on women in politics, political debates and campaigns, and First Ladies rhetoric. She began teaching about the suffrage movement over 25 years ago as part of a course on women in politics. She has lectured extensively on the subject, especially as part of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. She has also taught Osher lifelong learning courses on suffrage through the University of Kansas. Please welcome Diana remotely, and we're very pleased to have you. Thank you, Diana.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy and Casey. And so far, all of our practice worked because we seem to all be here together. So I'm very pleased to be here. I really want to thank the Ames History Museum and the Ames Public Library for the invitation. I was so disappointed that I wasn't able to be with you in March. And when we rescheduled this for June, I don't think any of us thought that we would still be sheltering at home, at least more or less. So thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. And please do feel free to send in some questions. I'm going to leave enough time to take some answers. As Kathy said, I've been interested in this topic for a lot of years and finally began digging into it when I started teaching a course at the University of Kansas on women in politics. And I was very intrigued by how these women actually got things done before they had the right to vote. And my mother was born the year after women got the right to vote. And there were a lot of women who she grew up with who had been part of this movement and had been really excited. And so we never missed voting in my family because there were people who remembered how hard fought it was. So I want to talk tonight. Let me share my screen and I'm going to get my slides up. Some of the time, there we go. All right. So I've called this Leading the Charge for the 19th Amendment because these were the women who led the charge. There was more than one charge, but since you're all in Iowa and you're in the home of Carrie Chapman Catt, and one of my former graduate students, Kelly Winfrey, is the Associate Director of the Catt Center, and I had the good fortune under Diane Bystrom, the previous director, to be part of some programming there several years ago when she was first getting the center started. And if you haven't looked at their website and their Facebook page, they have so much wonderful information about the 19th Amendment, especially the role that Iowa plays. We've heard so much about the main leaders, and the thing is they were just simply the leaders because the army of women who were involved were all across this country. And Midwestern women played a huge part in getting suffrage passed. And so what I want to do tonight is concentrate on this center part of the country and some of these unheralded, unknown, unsung heroines of the 19th Amendment. So I'm going to really try to answer three questions for you tonight. One, why did it take so long for this to happen? Why was it the 20th century and 20 years into it after 80 years of formal struggle? Why did it take so long? Who were some of those early leaders? Not just the national movement, but those women in the Midwest. And then what did those Midwestern women contribute? So why did it take so long? Well, first of all, it took a long time because women weren't allowed to speak in public. There were many prohibitions against women speaking in public, and you can't very well organize a movement if you can't speak and you can't get people organized. So first, there were a lot of religious barriers. And one of them, the interpretation of the Bible from the colonial period and before that, was that women had no right to advise men. And so in order to participate in the public sphere, in order to participate in voting and electoral politics, you would be advising men as to whom should be elected. And so if the Bible is telling you that women don't have that right, then women shouldn't participate in the political process, nor should they even speak out publicly. They can advise their husbands all they want at home, but publicly, no. So they quoted the King James Bible, "Let your women keep silence in churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." And then Cotton Mather, who was a pretty fiery Puritan minister, wrote this treatise called Ornaments for the Daughters of Zion, or The Character and Happiness of the Virtuous Woman. And this was written at the end of the 17th century. And he outlined what women's responsibilities were and what women were not supposed to be doing. And one of those was to be speaking in public. So he basically said that women were in charge of their homes, and this is where their power was, and that's where it should remain. But in addition to the religious prohibitions, education was also a problem. Women certainly lacked educational background. The earliest colleges in this country were for men only. And women, even wealthy women in colonial, especially colonial Virginia and the other parts of the South, didn't have formal education. Tutors came. So their education was basically homeschooling, a little different than a lot of people have been going through the last few months. But it was very limited in what they got. So you didn't have the kind of education, the experience to speak. Some of them wrote, but once again, it was very limited to correspondence. So to write the kinds of documents that the founding fathers wrote, there were women who were smart enough. Some of them had been educated by their fathers or families, but once again, it wasn't their place. Politically, women had no rights. Many of these early suffrage leaders didn't marry. Many of them did, but many of them didn't. And Susan B. Anthony, for example, said that the reason that she didn't marry was as soon as a woman married, she was civilly and politically dead because she had no rights. And essentially, that was one of the reasons why the early suffrage movement grew out of the abolition movement. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other reason it took so long was simply the cultural barriers. This notion of not just from the religious perspective, but also from a culture that the public space, business, politics, anything that happened in public was the domain of men, and that the private sphere, the home, the children, anything that went on in the private space, that belonged to the woman, and there she was really in charge. They also viewed women functionally. They had certain responsibilities. They were to basically bear the children, raise the children, take care of the home, take care of the finances in the home. And they also viewed them very sentimentally and very ornamentally, that women were someone you put up on a pedestal. They considered us better than men. We were more moral. We were less prone to all of the kinds of temptations of men. And so when you viewed women as someone attractive to look at, or someone who you thought was, you know, this pure person, you didn't want them becoming involved in politics because it was dirty. It always has been. And then this notion that speaking was an unnatural act for a woman. And part of this came from the fact that women were more soft-spoken. And think back to a period of time when you didn't have public address systems, no microphones. And so a woman's voice wouldn't project. So it just didn't seem to be a natural type of thing for a woman to do. So all of these things held women back, and then it took a while for women to begin to figure out how they could develop some agency to get something done. In terms of barriers to voting, men had to give women the right, and people don't give up power very easily or share it. So why should they give up some of their own power to give it to women? There were also women who opposed it, especially women who were in upper classes, although that was who led this movement in many ways, but there were an equal number of women who were very happy with the position they were in, did not consider themselves oppressed. And so there were women who opposed it. And when you didn't have unity among the women, that became a way for men to create a wedge issue because not all women agreed. And then other issues got in the way. You had a civil war, you had abolition, you had the post-Civil War Reconstruction, you had World War I, you had the Spanish flu, you had temperance, which women were very active in the temperance movement, and because of liquor dealers and liquor producers, they thought if women got the right to vote that we'd end up with, guess what, a prohibition amendment, which we eventually got. So there were many, many other factors besides the vote itself, which caused some problems and were barriers to giving women the right to vote. And then the anti-suffrage arguments. Women don't want to vote. And there were all of these very badly done polls that showed that women, majority women, didn't have any interest in voting. And one of the major arguments that comes back to this separation of public and private spheres was that women didn't need to vote because men were taking care of them through their own votes. And if women were given the right to vote, it would make no difference in the outcome because they would simply vote the way their husbands told them to, because their husbands would be the educated ones. So it was like, it doesn't really matter. They trust their husbands. They should trust their husbands. And they're going to just do what their husbands tell them anyway. And the other argument, this gets back to the sentimentality and purity issue, was that women enjoyed this nonpartisan influence. They could maybe talk to their husband, the pillow talk idea, the dinner table talk about their views, but they didn't have to participate in a partisan way. They could be totally nonpartisan. And one of the nonpartisan ways that women got things done before they had the right to vote was through petitions. And one of the things the Constitution gives to every citizen, even those who were not allowed to vote, was the right to petition the government. So there were hundreds of petitions that women sent to Congress, and some of the time in big, they'd have caravans with many wagons full of petitions signed for various issues. And so this was a nonpartisan way of participating. And the argument was that's a much better way for women to be involved. Then they were going to remove these natural differences between the sexes, that women were going to try to act like men. And then you would have all of these slippery slope arguments. Once women started voting, then they were going to want to do other things men did. And women would lose the very essence of who they were. They would probably be wearing slacks like I am now. And then the ballot isn't an effective cure-all. It's not going to change with women voting. Politics can't really improve our lives, is one of the arguments. And so if women really want to improve conditions, there are all these other ways they need to do it, through their volunteer work, through their churches, because the ballot doesn't necessarily solve everything. So these were the things that these women were up against. So who were these early leaders? If you look at a lot of the timelines on suffrage, and you can Google women's suffrage timeline, they often start with 1848. And 1848 is a very important date because that was the year that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and a group of other leaders both women and men, met in Seneca Falls, New York, and they issued the Declaration of Sentiments, which was basically the Declaration of Independence, but talking about, instead of the king and parliament as being the oppressors, talking about men as oppressors. And they talked about everything that men basically subjected women to. For instance, they couldn't vote. They couldn't own property if they were married. They couldn't sue for divorce. They couldn't get their children if their husband sued them for divorce. If they were married and they earned any kind of income, it went to their husband. They had to give it to him. If they were unmarried and they lived with their parents, the money went to their father. So they had no control over anything. And there's just this long list of grievances. So 1848 is seen as a start of the suffrage movement, but I would argue that really the women who tried to make this part of the consciousness of the men who were making decisions in this country came much earlier. And the first one is one of my heroines, Abigail. And you're all probably familiar with this letter she wrote to John in 1776, when she wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited powers in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." And certainly there were women who followed that later. So Abigail was one of the first ones to really speak out and to try to give women rights in this government. Speaking of rights, Frances Wright, who, if you have heard of Frances Wright, write a little comment and let me know. Frances Fanny Wright was one of the first women who dared to give a speech in public in the United States. And she probably got away with it because she wasn't an American, she was Scottish. She was born in Scotland and she read Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and knew about our whole revolution and really felt that this was the kind of document that she could believe in. And she was very active in the abolition movement in the United Kingdom. And she thought that probably the United States, because of this declaration, had a better chance of eventually having abolition than maybe England or Scotland. So she moved to the US in 1817, and she came first as an abolitionist, but also an abolitionist who believed that women should also have rights, as she was speaking out. So she was the first woman, as I said, to actually speak to a mixed audience of men and women about both abolition and women's rights. And back then they called an audience of both men and women a promiscuous audience because you were mingling the two. And this was unheard of, and of course got a lot of the church leaders totally up in arms, because you still had situations in some of the colonial churches and even into the early 1800s where the women sat on one side, the men sat on another. And so for 2 years, she stayed in the US and she toured. She went into the Midwest. I think she got as upper Midwest. She got as far west as Ohio. And she lectured on abolition and women's rights. So she was one of the first to really speak out in a truly public way. Maria Miller Stewart was speaking about the same time, just a few years later than Frances Wright. And she's somebody who doesn't appear in our history books. Somebody once said that women are the forgotten men of history. And we're really learning during this 19th Amendment how many of these women we did not learn about. And my students get angry when they start hearing about all this history that they didn't learn and say, why not? Well, who writes history for the most part? And who made it? And we kind of had the great man theory of a lot of history, so women got left out. Plus, we had all these reasons working against them. But Maria Miller Stewart is very important because she was a free African-American woman in the Northeast. And she was literate, extremely literate, an excellent writer and a speaker. And this is one of the publications that she wrote. She was a native of Connecticut, but she lived in Boston most of the time. She married and was widowed very early. And she began working with a man who was incredibly important to the suffrage movement long before Susan B. Anthony and some of the others came on the scene. And that was William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the major abolitionists in the country. And Garrison was one who found women who were literate, who were good speakers, who could write, and he basically mentored these women into going out and facing hostile audiences to start spreading the abolition message, but along with it, women's rights. So she was the first woman to actually speak to give a public speech to free African American women. And then in 1832, she spoke to both African American women and men. And she made history because, just like Frances Wright was the first woman to publicly go across the US at the time and speak publicly, she was the first woman to speak to a mixed gender and mixed race audience, but she's not in our history books. So one of the early leaders in the suffrage movement, and she talked about the importance of education, and that if you deny women education, you're really denying them the inability to do some of the things women are supposed to do, and that is take care of their children, take care of their home, but also that they need to be part of this public sphere. Two other women, and if any of you have read the Sue Monk Kidd book, The Invention of Wings, it's about Angelina and Sarah Grimke. And the Grimke sisters were also some of the mentees of William Lloyd Garrison. They were originally Southerners, raised on a South Carolina plantation. Their father was a judge, so they were very well educated. He made sure that all of his children were educated. They began to oppose slavery, and they started having house meetings with some of the women in colonial South Carolina, or in South Carolina. And they weren't being very well received. So Sarah eventually joined the Quakers because they tended to believe in abolition, and they seemed to be more in tune with her value system. So she moved to Philadelphia. She eventually married, and then Angelina followed her. She also converted to the Quaker religion. And then they both worked with Garrison. And they were among the first to really publicly begin promoting women's rights. They were also the first agents of this anti-slavery society. And both of them wrote tracts. Angelina's was on the Appeal to Christian Women of the South, abolition, and then Sarah wrote letters on the equality of the sexes. But what was interesting, especially about the Grimkes, was that they were willing to step out of this into the public sphere because they were Quakers. And one of the things about many of the early leaders of the movement was that they were Quakers. And that had an impact on their ability to do two things. One, to be comfortable with public speaking, because in Quaker meeting houses, anyone could speak out. They didn't have ministers to lead them. And secondly, that in Quaker meeting houses, men and women were treated equally. So they had experienced equality and they had experience speaking. So they brought that to both the abolition and the women's rights movement. There were threats against them to burn down buildings. They began speaking to mixed audiences, and the Congregational ministers in 1837 wrote a tract condemning them and writing all of these reasons why it was once again unnatural for women to be doing this. And as I said, they were threatened to have the buildings burned down. There were rioters outside. They created a lot of anger, especially men. And so that was the Grimke sisters, the first of the Quakers. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is one of the names we know about, and she is one of the three leaders who is featured in the statue in the rotunda of the Capitol. She also had a judge for a father, and she was formally educated at an academy and at a female seminary, and the seminary was used in a very different term. It wasn't really a college, it was more a high school, finishing school, but she had an opportunity to have some formal education. And she became a feminist and a suffragist at a very young age. She would sit and listen to her father when he had clients in his office. And there was a woman one day, a widow, who came to him because her husband, she had brought property into the marriage, which then became her husband's. Well, her husband had lost all of the property in bad debts, and she is left destitute, a widow with children and no money. And she wanted Judge Cady to get her money back. And he told her it didn't work that way. It was no longer her property to get back. It had been her husband's. He could do what he wanted. So Elizabeth was furious when she heard this, and he said, "It's the law." So she went into his law books later, and she tried to tear out the pages with these laws. And he found her and said, Elizabeth, that isn't the way to do this. You need to go write new laws. So she was determined to find ways that women had more power. She had a husband, fortunately, who agreed with her, and they were both abolitionists, and they spent their honeymoon in London attending an anti-slavery convention, along with Lucretia Coffin Mott. And they met there, but they were not allowed into the convention. And this angered them. They came back and got their heads together, and along with their husbands and a group of other Quaker husbands and wives, they decided to call the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So she was one of the co-authors with Mott of the Declaration. And then she was one of the co-founders of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Let me do a little sidebar here. These women were called suffragists, ISTS, not suffragettes. The British suffrage leaders were suffragettes, and they often resorted to far more militant tactics. And so these women wanted to be called suffragists so that they would not be lumped into the same group as these controversial women across the pond. And when people did call them suffragettes, it was considered a derogatory term. So suffragist is the correct word for the US suffrage leaders. So she was one of the co-founders of the association and also one of the co-authors of the History of Women. And there was a wonderful documentary that Ken Burns did a few years ago about her and Susan B. Anthony, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton really got the ball rolling. Lucretia Coffin Mott was her partner before Anthony came on the scene. And she was also the co-author, also an abolitionist and suffragist, and she helped found Swarthmore College. She was one of the Quakers. She was a teacher. And she became interested in women's rights when she found that women teachers didn't get paid as much as men. She gave a lot of speeches, and she was one like the Grimkes who also experienced violence with some of her anti-slavery speeches. She later, after the Civil War, opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments because they left out women. She didn't oppose the rights for African Americans, but she wanted it to be rights for African American men and women and all women. So one of these early women. And then, of course, Susan B. Anthony, who we all have much about. She didn't originally start out as a suffragist. She was a temperance and abolitionist. And she'd worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton for a few years on temperance and abolition issues. But she didn't think she needed to really promote women's rights. And then she was not allowed into a convention, a temperance convention. And she also discovered that as a teacher, she wasn't making as much as the men. So she finally went back to Elizabeth and said, "You're absolutely right. I now do the suffrage movement with you." She started a newspaper called Revolution in 1868 after the Civil War, which was one of the first suffrage newspapers and was, once again, one of the founders of the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1872, she voted illegally. There was a group of women across the country that decided they were going to try to challenge because they really argued that the 14th Amendment gave them rights as citizens. If the way it was written, it could be interpreted. So she voted illegally. She was arrested. She was fined. She wouldn't pay the fine. Wonderful, wonderful. You can find the transcript of the trial, and I highly recommend if you have some free time during these shelter-at-home days and all that, you maybe take a look at it because it's really an interesting defense. So how did Midwestern women contribute? Because so far we've just seen the East Coast. We've been pretty well limited to East Coast women. Well, Midwestern women started contributing from the very beginning. And one of the interesting things about the suffrage movement and rights is that we mark 1920 because of the 19th Amendment. But before 1920, there were a lot of women in this country who had the right to vote in all elections, and they were all west of the Mississippi. The earliest adopters of voting rights were west of the Mississippi. And part of the reason for that was that they were territories and they had to write new constitutions. And so it was much easier to write something into a constitution than to amend one. So let me talk about one of the women in Kansas. And I may be a little partially my own state. Ooh, something happened to this. I don't know what. I apologize, but I'll tell you what it says. Clarina Howard Nichols is another one of those unheralded women, but she was right there with Anthony and Stanton. She was part of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She gave speeches there. She spoke around the country. She was originally from Vermont, but moved to Kansas in 1854 when the state began being settled as a territory to get the population up for a vote. And she had been lobbying the Vermont legislature to amend their constitution, and they wouldn't do it. In fact, they yelled at her, told her a woman shouldn't be speaking. She had all the same problems these other women had. So when she moved to Kansas, they were in the process of writing the Constitution under which they became a state in 1861, the Wyandotte Constitution. And she learned her lesson. So she stayed in the domestic sphere. And all of her women friends who were wanting a free state constitution with women's rights put into it would go to the convention, and they would knit, and they would have refreshments for the delegates at the break. And in the evenings, they would provide meals for the men who were in town from around the territory. And they would just kind of lobby them before that word had ever been created. And so what she did was she got 3 things into the Kansas Constitution that were incredibly important for women's rights. The first one was that women could vote in school board elections. Any woman could vote in school board elections. Kentucky let widows vote in school board elections because they didn't have a man to vote for them. And then later they let spinsters vote. But she said, all women should vote. If you're going to give us responsibility for educating our children, we need to decide who's going to be running the schools. Then she said, we're about to go to, this was when bleeding Kansas, the Kansas-Missouri wars were going on. And she said, a lot of men are already dying. More are going to die. We know there's going to be a war at some point. And so if women are going to learn how to manage property, run businesses, they need to be able to own it and manage it after marriage. So the Kansas Constitution gave them that right. And then also that judges would determine who got custody of children if a man sued for divorce. She wanted something else in the Constitution, which they didn't put, but they put it in as a legislative act after it became a state. And that was that when the University of Kansas opened, women could study in any field. At this point, women were beginning to be admitted to colleges, but they were limited in the subjects they could study. It was more the domestic sphere kinds of things. They could study literature, they could study art, they could study music, they could study languages, they could study domestic arts, but they couldn't get into business, they couldn't get into law, anything that was really in the male domain. So she became an advocate not only in Kansas, but also in other parts of the Midwest and the West, and was also very active with Stanton and the other leaders of the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1887, Kansas gave women the right to vote and to hold office in city elections. And in that year, the very first woman mayor in the United States was elected in Kansas, in a little town of Argonia. She was a temperance leader, and she was a write-in candidate because the men couldn't quite agree. And so they did this sort of as a joke. And a lot of people heard that they were going to start writing her in. So the women showed up, she was elected. And then there was another woman elected mayor soon after that. And by 1900, Kansas had already had 16 women serving as mayors in the state. They also had the first all-city women council in Oskaloosa and Syracuse. And this is a picture of the Oskaloosa. They were elected right after Susanna Salter was. One of them was not the mayor, however, they had a separate mayor. And then 2 years later, Cottonwood Falls had an all-city government. So Kansas was really a leader in all of this, in that they gave women voting rights much sooner than any of the other states. And in 1867, they tried to get the Constitution amended to give women voting rights in all elections. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all of the leaders came to Kansas. Lucy Stone and her husband, and tried to get that in the Constitution. It failed, however. But there were women who picked up that mantle, and one woman who had originally come from Illinois was Lilla Day Monroe, and she was the first woman who was admitted to practice law before the Kansas Supreme Court. And she became a real suffrage leader, founded a club, government club. She edited a suffrage newspaper, and she basically was the one who, after suffrage, kind of did a lot of what Carrie Chapman Catt did, with Catt founding the League of Women Voters. And she started a journal that would help women become better educated voters. And she championed all of the issues that affected women, such as better working conditions, children's conditions, health issues. Missouri. For the suffrage movement coming out of Missouri was Virginia Minor. She was one of the Missouri leaders. She helped found the Missouri Women's Suffrage Association. And this is what happened. After the National Association was formed, all of these other states then formed their own state chapters. It took a little bit of time for some states. One other thing I should say in terms of the West is that in 1869, Wyoming became a territory, and they gave women full voting rights in all elections. And they were also the first state to have a woman governor. So west of the Mississippi, and part of the reason for it was not because these men were so open-minded and really progressive and informed. It was because they needed to attract women to the West, because you had to have a certain number of people in the territory before you could become a state. So you can't increase population with just men. So they decided that if they let women vote, that women would be more likely to move, and it worked in many instances. But Virginia Minor was one of the women in 1872 who tried to register to vote, and she was turned away by the register of deeds in St. Louis. She took her case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Susan B. Anthony didn't go any farther than her local court because of the fine. But Virginia Minor said, I'm taking this. And she went through all the regular appeals and then took it to the Supreme Court of the U.S. in Minor versus Happersett, and Happersett was the person who denied her the right to vote. She lost, and she based it on the 14th Amendment. But she was definitely somebody who was going to push the envelope and really challenge the status quo. Another Missouri woman who was really important was Emily Newell Blair, and she was also very active in the Missouri Suffrage Association. It was a publicity chair, and she was the one who got attention for the suffrage movement in Missouri, and she edited their suffrage publication. She later became, when women got the right to vote after 1920, she became the vice chair of the women's division of the Democratic Party, and she began pushing women, not just in Missouri, but around the country, to start running for office. Edna Fischel Gellhorn was another Missourian. She was president of the St. Louis Association, and she was also a president of the Missouri Women's Suffrage Association, and became vice president of the League of Women Voters after Carrie Chapman Catt founded it. So you had Iowa and Missouri leading the league early on. So this Midwest piece is very important. And then she was one who, after women got the right to vote, began organizing rallies and parades, and realized it wasn't enough to have the vote. You had to get women into the system. In Nebraska, rather than looking at women, they were a little late to the game, but they attempted constitutional amendments in 1881, 82. They didn't work. But Omaha became a very important site, and both the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association had their conventions in Omaha, and Carrie Chapman Catt was instrumental in some of that happening. And there were two associations by this time, because Lucretia Mott had separated from Stanton and Anthony because she didn't think they were moving fast enough. They didn't agree on whether it should be a state by state or you should go with a national referendum. So there were always splits among these women, but both conventions thought that Nebraska, because it was west of the Mississippi, Kansas was beginning to, do some things. You began to have these other western states, but it simply didn't work. So all the major suffrage leaders were in Nebraska. And then they did grant 3 years before the 19th Amendment went into effect some limited suffrage where they could vote in local races and hold office, and they could vote for the electors for the Electoral College. So they didn't give them the right to vote in the popular vote, but they gave them the right in the Electoral College. The Dakotas were in a lot of activity. Emma Smith DeVoe ended up in what was the South Dakota part of the Dakota Territory. But at the age of 8, she heard Susan B. Anthony speak in her hometown, which was in Illinois at the time. And she became a very good friend of Carrie Chapman Catt because she began leading the Dakota Territory movement. And Catt was working with all of these women in these western states. She had great fundraising expertise, and at one of the conventions in Des Moines, Catt introduced her as a fundraising expert. And she said, you know, I don't really directly ask for money. I just tell about the cause, and the pocketbooks open. And then she worked on suffrage in both in the Dakotas and then in Idaho and Washington state. And those were states that also gave women the right to vote early. So a very important person and a compatriot of Carrie Chapman Catt's. The nice thing about all these borders being close is you really had these Midwestern women working very closely together. Another woman in South Dakota was Alice Pickler, and she was one of the other early women in the Dakota territories. And they first had a vote for full suffrage in 1868, a year after Kansas did. And once again, all the major leaders showed up and were hoping it would happen in the territory because you had Wyoming do this. Wyoming was also looking at it, and they actually passed it the next year. It didn't win. She was also a temperance leader, and she was on the executive board of the American Women's Suffrage Association, the Mott. So she was very, very active nationally also. And her husband was one of those men who was right there with his wife, and they called him Old Petticoats, Pickler, because he supported suffrage in both the legislature and the Congress. And it was obviously an insult to him, but they had a real partnership. And then she became very, very important after suffrage and getting a lot of this work done. Another woman who helped Dakota, she wasn't in South Dakota, she was actually a New Yorker, but South Dakota claims her in terms of suffrage because she moved from New York. This is one of those women really lost to history, and part of the reason was that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony wrote her out of the history. She had been thick as thieves with them and was part of their association and helped write the history of women's suffrage with them. But she also thought they were moving too slowly, and she became a little more radical to them, and they had a parting of the ways. She's interesting in that she is the mother-in-law, or was the mother-in-law of L. Frank Baum, the author of the Wizard of Oz series. And when two of her children moved to South Dakota, she went there to see her grandchildren, help her children, and she also wanted to bring suffrage to the Dakota Territory. So she was really one of the important leaders and organizers of the Dakota Territory because she had this incredible wealth of experience from having worked with the very beginning with Stanton and Anthony from the start. She'd also been part of the abolition movement. And as I said, she was philosophically more radical, and she was another one of these women in 1872 who tried to vote, and she supported Victoria Woodhull, who was the first woman to actually run for president on an independent ticket. And then let's come back with Amelia Bloomer, who is known for her change in the way women dress. The Bloomers were named after her, even though they had been developed before her, but she popularized them. And this was part of this whole liberation thing, is if you stop and think about the corsets and the way women dressed and things they were expected to be doing in these clothes, you know, this was a freedom issue too. But she was originally from New York and moved to Council Bluffs, and she had been very active in the women's rights movement before the Civil War, and then brought that activism with her to Iowa. And she was first president of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, and like I said, known for reforming women's clothing. Another Iowan who was very important was Mary Jane Coggeshall, and she really helped launch the movement in Iowa and worked for 40 years. She was another one of those who put in decades of work and didn't ever get to vote. She was Carrie Chapman Catt's mentor and was the one who really brought her along in the movement and taught her a lot of the ropes from all those years of experience she had. And she was an editor of one of these women's suffrage publications, the Women's Standard. And she was the first woman from the West who served on the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this was when the two warring parties eventually merged toward the end. So once again, she was very important in that the Western voice became a very important part of this national movement. Iowan, African-American woman, was Sue Wilson Brown, and she was also an active leader in the NAACP. And then when the League of Women Voters was being formed, they formed also a League of Colored Women Voters, and she was the first president of the Des Moines League. So another very important woman. there was simultaneously, there were times when the African American women and the white women were working together, and there were other times when politically they didn't consider it feasible because they didn't want to be confusing a lot, especially with the 14th, 15th Amendments. They wanted to kind of keep suffrage separate from men's rights, after African American men's rights. So it caused a lot of collision and a lot of controversy with the way some of the African American women were treated. She was a very important part of that from Iowa. And then, of course, Carrie Chapman Catt. And you and Ames really can claim her. And the Catt Center is, you know, an incredible institution that's carrying on her work way beyond. Originally from Wisconsin, moved to Iowa, Iowa State graduate. And she succeeded Anthony as the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she was very instrumental in getting the 19th Amendment passed, and of course founded the League of Women Voters. And you can't really talk about Carrie Chapman Catt and finally leading the final charge toward the 19th Amendment without talking about her nemesis, Alice Paul. Alice Paul was another one of the Quakers, very well educated, had a PhD. She'd lived in England. And while she was a Quaker, she didn't go in for the more militant kinds of things that the suffragettes were doing. But she broke away from the NAWSA and founded the National Women's Party. And she decided that they weren't getting enough attention. The whole movement had been around for 80 years and nothing was happening. State by state wasn't going to cut it because the states were so slow. And so she started leading silent protests. And she and a group of women who were known as the Silent Sentinels stood in front of the White House in terrible weather for months and months and months and said nothing, but had these signs. And they would shift. They'd have a morning shift and an afternoon shift. And if you can really, you can't see very well, but this is someone from Kansas. This is someone from Missouri. Because what's happened is in 1912, Kansas gave women the right to vote. And in 1908, several other states did. So by 1912, there were 8 states west of the Mississippi where women had full voting rights. And Missouri was working to try to get it. So here you have a couple Midwestern women who've come out. And so these women were coming from all over the country, and especially from the West and the Midwest, to help with this movement. And what happened was they began, when World War I started, they really ramped up some of their rhetoric, and they ended up arresting them on a false charge of interfering with traffic. Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt had very different approaches. Catt was the diplomat. She dined at the White House with Wilson. She could walk into senators and representatives' offices and get meetings. And she believed that diplomacy was the way to do it, along with Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, who was also one of the women who led that National Women's Association. So they were at odds on how to do it. But the thing that Paul did that helped Catt was Paul's arrest and the imprisonment of a bunch of women, the force feeding when they went on a hunger strike, the conditions of the workhouse they were in, became public knowledge. And they began to get the press, and they began to turn Wilson, and they began to turn members of Congress when they saw what was happening. And that enabled Catt then to come in and be the diplomat and put the icing on the cake. There are a few books that I would recommend that you look at. There are dozens of them out there. But there are 2 really good biographies of Carrie Chapman Catt. And you'll have this to go back and look at, since it will be on video. These others that are more generic to the suffrage movement, one called Women's Suffrage and Politics. One of my favorite ones, which I actually found at the Wizard of Oz Museum in Wamego, Kansas, is called Born Criminal. And it's about Matilda Joslyn Gage and everything that she did, a radical suffragist, fascinating woman. The next one, Why They Marched, The Woman's Hour, Votes for Women, One Woman, One Vote, and Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. All of these will give you a really rich history. They all kind of cover different pieces, and you'll see some of these women I've talked about mentioned in some of these books. I could do an hour on the women from all of the states west of the Mississippi without any problem at all. But we should be proud as Midwesterners of our heritage of leading and producing women like Carrie Chapman Catt, who helped make this possible, and then who created an organization like the League of Women Voters because she knew women had to be educated. So with that said, I would be happy now to answer your questions. Kathy, should I look for them? I like some of the comments, if you're all seeing them. Yes, I've even had to correct some history museums about the suffrage. In fact, something that came out of the Kansas Historical Society had suffragette instead of suffrage. And I agree, Clarina, incredibly progressive woman. And people are not aware that so many states had given the right to vote before 1920. So, Kathy, do you have some other questions? Okay, oh, there's a Q&A.
Yeah, Diana, one question that has come in is, which state do you think did the most to contribute?
Oh, that's a tough one. As far as where a lot of the leadership came from, it was New York. And it's somewhat ironic because Stanton, Anthony, Gage, a lot of these other women came out in New York, but New York didn't give women the vote early. They couldn't even turn their own state. As far as the Midwest, and I'm not saying this just because I'm a Kansan, but quite frankly, Kansas was a very important one, along with Wyoming Territory, because Kansas had women elected to office in the 1880s. I think that made a difference, and it showed other states that women could do this and could be very successful, but still be women. So I think Wyoming was important. Kansas was important. Iowa obviously produced some of the leaders, and you can't deny that if Iowa hadn't produced a Carrie Chapman Catt and some of these other women who worked with her, they made a huge difference in finally getting it through Wilson into Congress.
What about the Quakers led them to give equality between the sexes?
The Quakers rejected a lot of what organized religion at the time did, and they were very simple people. They were really, rebelling against all of the ceremony and money that was put into churches and rituals of the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church. They didn't think that the reformers, like Calvin and all, had gone far enough. And they also didn't think that it necessarily took an ordained minister to help you understand the Bible. So the reason that this equality came was that they felt that collectively they could learn from one another. And so part of that collectivity was women. And they didn't interpret the Bible the way that many others had interpreted about the separation. So it was just basically their opposition to a lot of the way formal religion was structured, and this kind of coming together in a meeting for discussion and learning together. And they believed that women and men should equally know what was in the Bible. So that was a lot of the religious philosophy that they had that then carried over into abolition and suffrage and temperance.
Do you see any parallel between suffrage and the civil unrest taking place today? And going along with that, someone else commented, some argue that Catt was a racist. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Okay, let me tell you, in fact, I've been thinking about that. 80 years these women waited. And when Alice Paul and the women started these mild protests, it was considered radical. I mean, they were dragging them off and, in these wagons and putting them in workhouses. They were frustrated. It had been 80 years of trying to get this to happen. Oh, I see Diane, yay. That New Yorkers did it all good. And I do think there are parallels. You can only take something for so long. And part of the reason there were so many splits within the women's organizations was that the frustration began taking hold. And some of these women really wanted to do some things that were a little more daring. So that was part of, so I do think there are similarities. You can't be suppressed forever and see that even when laws change, a lot doesn't change with it. Even after the right to vote, it's still, we had the second wave of feminism in the 60s. because we still had laws on the books that, for instance, a woman couldn't get a credit card without her husband's signature if she was married. That was still in the late 60s. Agricultural land still belonged to a husband if a wife brought it into marriage in a lot of states. So it took us, you know, another 40, 50 years to begin to change some of the laws. And we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. As far as Catt being a racist, a lot of the women who were part of this movement were accused of being racist. It wasn't just Catt. Susan B. Anthony was accused of being a racist and anti-immigrant. And when I teach this class, I have them read a speech that Susan B. Anthony gave in Kansas. She spent a lot of time here because she had a brother here and a cousin, and her cousin ran for the legislature, and her brother was a newspaper publisher, and he helped fund a lot of her work. So she spent a lot of time in Kansas, was always trying to get this amendment through, and they got it through early. But she gave a speech that sounds incredibly racist and anti-immigrant, and my students are just stunned because this isn't what they expected from her. But essentially what these women were saying was, look, we've been at this for a long time, and we helped with abolition. We supported the North in the Civil War, you know, and we have supported rights for all African Americans, not just African American men. And you've given these African American men the right to vote, but you haven't given it to us. And then with immigrants, you could be an immigrant and not be a naturalized citizen yet and vote in some states. And so they're seeing people who aren't even citizens. So it was a frustration issue. Catt was politically savvy. And in states like Kansas, where they had tried originally in 1867, they had both an amendment this was before the 14th and 15th Amendments had come into play. They had an amendment to give African Americans, men, voting rights, and another amendment to give women voting rights. And they played against one another, and they saw that by putting the two together, and the other problem was they needed the South. The only way you were going to get the amendment through was you had to have Southern states ratify it. In fact, Tennessee was the last state to ratify, to put it over the top. And so the Southern problem became Carrie Chapman Catt's problem and the other leaders' problem, is that if you wanted this done, you couldn't bring African American women visibly into it, because you've got to think about what the South was like. The lynchings, the Ku Klux Klan, the Jim Crow Acts, you know, all of the ballot issue, you know, the access to ballot wasn't really for African American men. And so they didn't want it tangled up with that. And Diane Bystrom, if you can give her the microphone, she might want to add something to this too. So I think they weren't racist, but they were being pragmatic politicians. And, you know, politics is really the art of the possible. And they had to have those Southern votes. They had to have the Southern votes in Congress. They had to have the Southern votes in the legislatures. And so this was part of the reason why they said some of the things they said, they made some of the decisions they made, and they did some things that, when we judge it today, look extremely racist. But they thought they were being very pragmatic politicians. Diane, if you want to add something, I'd love to have you do that.
I guess I'm unmuting now. Can you hear me?
You're unmuted. Great.
Okay. I sent a chat. I mean, I think what's going on, and having directed the Catt Center for 22 years, is that there's a quote by Catt that was actually in a book chapter written in 1917 that was said by students in 1995 to be part of speeches in South Carolina and Mississippi, but that never occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So while I agree that women suffrage leaders were strategic, the quotes attributed to Catt were never said in speeches.
Yeah.
And that's a sad thing. And so it lives online. You know, I do think that women suffrage leaders were strategic. And actually what I wrote in the chat box is that I get so irritated that Carrie Chapman Catt is blamed for all this stuff when Alice Paul was the one that told African Americans to march at the back of the parade.
That's right.
I've even had people say to me, oh, Carrie Chapman Catt did this. She was in Europe. And so, you know, I do think there were strategic things. I think you need to remember with Catt is that, and I actually have, you know, editorials from Tennessee that vilified her for supporting African American women to vote, which she wrote in The Crisis, which is the journal of the NAACP. So I don't think Catt was a racist, and I don't know.
I don't either.
And so here's what I think is that there was racism in the suffrage movement, and you've studied it as long as I have, Diana, and it really occurred when the two organizations split and Susan B. came to Kansas. She was affiliated with a racist at the time, and Carrie Chapman Catt was 9 years old at the time. So in my opinion, Carrie Chapman Catt gets blamed for a lot of racism in the suffrage movement, which did occur, but she wasn't the main proponent of it. And they had it actually was Henry Blackwell that, you know, he was an abolitionist. He thought they could win southern states by, you know, advocating that, and that didn't work, so they gave it up. So anyway, I don't want to take away from your presentation.
Oh, no, but I know you have studied Catt.
When people even ask this question, and I think a lot of people in Ames believe that because it's based on poor research by a student in 1995. So
our students aren't always perfect. But one thing that I think really does, and if you all go on the National Archives website, it's too bad you can't get into any of this because the exhibit they have on the 19th Amendment is fantastic. And they take on this issue of racism. And they talk about this and talk about the fact that Ellis Paul had this big march when the inauguration in 1917 happened with Wilson's second term. And, you know, they didn't want the African-American women marching with them. And so Ellis Paul did move them to the back. And there's a whole section in there on the race issue in terms of the suffrage movement. And I do think a lot of it's misunderstood, like you said, attributed to Catt, things that she didn't really say in speeches. I mean, we're seeing that now. Fake news, distortion, disinformation. This did not start in the last 5 or 10 years. It's always been there. And if something, unfortunately, when something gets said and it gets repeated over and over, it becomes the truth. But I really do not believe that Catt was racist. I don't think that in her heart Anthony was racist. I think she was, like I said, at the end of her career, she was frustrated, and she was starting to say some things too that are somewhat shocking when you read them today. And she wasn't alone. Some of these other women were the same way. And you're right, that split with the association, I think, was part of it too, with Mott going off the other direction. So it was a long, long time coming. Somebody asked if I knew anything about Susan B. Anthony, how she sounded as an orator. And I don't know that I've read some newspaper articles. She spent a lot of time down in Southeast Kansas, where I'm from. And I spent some time in an archive down there with all of her letters and the newspaper articles about her. But there was nothing said about the way she spoke. However, she was in Kansas for the big push for in 1912, or before 1912. And she had Anna Howard Shaw with her. And the newspapers did write about Shaw's speaking style, because she was also a minister. But there was nothing said about Anthony's. So I don't know. I haven't really hadn't thought about that. It was an interesting question. And I may dig around through some of these other newspaper articles about Anthony to see. But Anna Howard Shaw was given very high marks as an orator by the Southeast Kansas newspapers that covered it.
Diana, I think we have time for one more. What would you like women today to take away from this rich history of suffrage?
That it's important to vote, that the vote was hard earned. You know, once again, when I teach this and I tell them about the silent sentinels, and we talk about the women, you know, threatening to burn buildings because they were giving speeches, you know, what they went through standing out in the cold and just canvassing and putting up with all the things that they put up with for 80 years, that this is something you should consider precious, that it is a right and a responsibility, and that women have an incredible amount of power at the polls. We outvote men for, you know, what, the last 20, almost 30 years. Women have voted in higher numbers than men. We have incredible power, but we only have it if we use that vote. It was hard fought, hard won, and it simply needs to be exercised. And Carrie Chapman Catt was absolutely right to start the League of Women Voters, because you also need to be an educated voter. And she wasn't the only one who believed that. So I think, you know, there's a legacy from these women, and they knew that they could change things, that they would not vote the same way as men, that it did matter what laws would pass. So all those anti-arguments, they put to rest over the years. And I think we've also seen that women in office tend to lead very differently. You can look at that with what's going on in some of the states here. And if you look worldwide, there's been this kind of meme on Facebook about the 7 countries with some of the lowest COVID numbers, all led by women. So it makes a difference. We make a difference. We're an important part of democracy, and we need to exercise our right to vote and thank these women for everything they did to make it possible. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Diana. That was great. And thanks again for attending, everyone, tonight. We hope to see you again on June 23rd for the Story County Courthouse Fight Lecture. Have a good rest of your evening, everybody.